for joining us. Why has it taken so long for the US to get weapons to the rebels? This was expected back in April earliest, I believe.
Yeah, Dominic, it's been a slog. Essentially, the administration early this year decided that as a matter of policy, it wanted to start providing the rebels with some aid. Initially, they decided the best course of action was providing non-lethal aid, stuff like food, possibly vehicles, radio communications equipment, things along those lines. However, this summer in June, they decided that given their concerns that President Assad was using chemical weapons, they wanted to up the ante and actually give the rebels what they needed the most, which is weapons and ammunitions. However, this has been a protracted debate. People on the Hill have raised questions. It's been difficult logistically getting the supplies to the Turkish border where they're being distributed, and it's only in recent weeks that the pipelines have begun flowing.
Well, one of the issues is who precisely we're giving these weapons to. We know the weapons that they're giving can actually be tracked. What kind of weapons are they giving them? And is it just AK-47s? And how really is it going to sort of level the playing field against the Syrian government forces?
That's a key question. What the rebels say they need the most are heavy weapons, anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. And that's something Washington is very, very reluctant to do based on its bad experiences in the past in places such as Afghanistan, where at the time it seemed like a good idea to empower some rebels, but then those weapons wound up in the wrong hands and were very difficult to track. So for the time being, the Americans have come up with a plan that's pretty interesting. What they did was this spring, they distributed a lot of MREs, these military ready-to-eat meals, and they distributed them through part of the Syrian opposition movement that they think is more moderate and that they think are people they can work with and trust. And what they wanted to do was see if they could unload a lot of these meals ready to eat across the border and prevent them from reaching the hands of jihadists, the rebels that America does not want to back. And that experiment, they feel, went fine. They think that, relatively little stuff went to the wrong side of the front lines, and that encouraged them to start the weapons pipeline.
So do we now know who exactly it is we're arming, and do we know exactly what it is that we're giving them? If it's small weapons, is it really going to make a tactical difference, or is it just going to create a gesture or appearance of a gesture of support to the rebels after they've been asking this from us for so long?
The U.S. has decided that it can work with a recently defected Syrian general who's the leader of the Supreme Military Council. This is what the Americans hope will become the backbone of the armed opposition. And so far they think that he has a fairly solid chain of command, that he has fairly decent lieutenants and a mechanism to provide weapons to rebels that will be held accountable and that are not extremists. However, I think the Americans have little visibility on what's happening across the border now. Once you unload these weapons, you don't really know who these rebel units, who these rebels are, how many ties there might be tactically in the field with jihadists, and sort of how these groups evolve over time. What the rebels have needed desperately recently has been ammunition, because they've been in protracted fights in Aleppo in the north and in other key battlegrounds that they held for a long time and then started losing to the regime. So they've been clamoring just for simple ammunition and simple weapons simply to hold the line. If they are to make advances in the long run, though, in the coming months, they're going to need some more firepower.
Where would that firepower come if the United States can't provide it? We've heard that the Qataris have provided weapons in the past. We've heard the Saudis have been providing it. Could we see actually heavier stuff come from them? And could we even get something like air support in there eventually?
That's certainly a possibility. I think there's a widespread assumption that the United States has acted as somewhat of a gatekeeper when it comes to what weapons are flowing across the border. And the United States has strong ties with both Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and both countries are supporting the rebels. There's many questions about what this intervention will become in the months ahead, and I think a lot of it will depend on how much traction you get diplomatically, how much of a sense you get that there's been some movement and some success in getting Syria to relinquish its stockpile of chemical weapons. I think if you were to see progress on that front, you might see American officials hitting the brakes on their military involvement just because it's risky. However, if diplomatic talks collapse and Washington, simply wants to see a rebel victory against the Assad regime, they might, have an incentive to do stuff that is riskier and to put, bigger weapons in the hands of these rebels.
The weapons that we have so far really kind of contradict what the United States has been criticizing Russia for all these months since the war started, and the fact that the Russians were arming the Assad regime. Now the United States is arming the rebels. How is that going to disrupt the negotiations taking place in Geneva between Washington and Moscow?
It's a very good question. The timing is certainly very, very awkward for the United States and what it is trying to accomplish through Russia. The Syrian president gave an interview recently that said that he was amenable to relinquishing his chemical stockpile as long as Washington stopped arming the rebels and as long as Washington put on hold the idea of a military strike. However, I don't get a sense that now that these pipelines have finally begun to flow and that many people in Congress are, sort of applauding this move and calling it, a long-delayed milestone in America's involvement in Syria, I think it's going to be hard to stop. I think we're only likely to see a pause in this if you see some serious unintended consequences. If you start seeing evidence that these weapons are reaching people that we don't feel comfortable supporting, or being used in a way that is questionable. For example, in human rights abuses, executions, conduct on the battlefield that is reprehensible.
And that is the biggest risk in all of this. Ernesto Ludoño at the Washington Post, thank you very much for joining us.